I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Try explaining the Mormon Health Code to skeptical non-Mormons. I dare you. This last weekend, I had the opportunity to go camping with our quarantine buddies who are fellow atheists, but they didn't grow up in Mormonism. And as we drank our mild drinks of barley and consumed some herbs in the season thereof, for a bit of entertainment, we played the Book of Mormon musical soundtrack. After the first song, they had dozens of questions about Mormon culture, praxis, theology, and any aspect of Mormonism. And we spent the rest of the evening just doing this to, everybody's amusement, especially yours truly. And I always get a kick out of explaining deep Mormon history and theology to people who know almost nothing about it. Of course, at some point in the night, the conversation shifted to the Mormon Health Code, known as the Word of Wisdom. According to the Word of Wisdom, Mormons can't drink hot drinks, which applies to coffee and tea because they have addictive caffeine, but not to hot cocoa or hot cider. They can't drink cold coffee or tea because they are brewed and they have caffeine, but cold sugary soda with caffeine is acceptable because it isn't brewed even though it has caffeine. In the Word of Wisdom, mild drinks of barley are permitted, but beer is absolutely forbidden in Mormon culture. Wine of your own make is also permitted, according to the text, but completely forbidden in Mormon culture. A largely vegetarian diet is encouraged, and meat is only permitted sparingly when plant foods are out of season, but most Mormons today are overweight with colons full of red meat. Also, tobacco is forbidden except for use on cattle and for rubbing on wounds. And this is one of the few things in Mormon culture that's actually consistent with the text of the Word of Wisdom. But consuming herbs in the season thereof, in the Mormon culture context, only refers to the seasonings that you use on your steak, right? It has nothing to do with herbal teas, medicinal plants, or therapeutic use of plants, unless they're in pill form from a doctor. So, how do we explain these major inconsistencies from the Word of Wisdom's text to the modern practice? Well, we follow the guidance of modern prophets, and the Word of Wisdom isn't a commandment, it's just wisdom. This explanation only seems to confuse the uninitiated when they try to wrap their mind around it. Frankly, there are many teachings and practices in the modern church which don't trace their roots to Mormon scripture, or if they do, it's often been changed so much so as to be nearly unrecognizable from the text, like the Word of Wisdom. According to the text, Mormonism is socialistic, the celestial kingdom is hell, great and spacious buildings are the very quintessence of evil, God is a singular, eternal entity, black people can only go to heaven as slaves because of the curse of dark skin. Only the prophet has the powers of sealing, and guys need probably 10 virgin wives to reach the highest level of the celestial kingdom. However, in modern Mormon culture, the church is viciously capitalistic and probably the wealthiest religion in the world, and certainly in America. The celestial kingdom is so good a person would kill themselves to get there. You can only get to heaven by doing special handshakes in the one church-owned great and spacious buildings. And, all of the largest buildings in Utah are owned by the church. God isn't so much a singular entity, but a member of a council of gods that we can eventually join. Black people can now go to heaven, but they are still cursed with dark skin. Temple workers have the power of sealing, and guys get excommunicated for practicing polygamy, and excommunication in Mormon culture and theology means damnation. Truly, in order to learn about Mormonism, you'll learn almost nothing about the modern practice by reading the standard scriptures. You have to be a member and attend for years before all of the quirks and features of Mormon culture begin to come into focus. And yes, it takes years. Mormons don't cast their pearls before swine or teach, the meat before the milk. New members can become very uncomfortable trying to learn these mannerisms and idiosyncrasies and all of these cultural interpretations of scripture because they are playing bocce ball when everything in Mormonism is insider baseball. This insider knowledge trend is really highlighted when it comes to the history of the church. Information you can learn in 7 hours of Googling and reading or watching YouTube videos will teach you more Mormon history than decades in the church. An astute Googler will have the upper hand on most lifelong members of the church in one afternoon. With that all in mind, today we're going to focus on an aspect of Mormon history which gets relatively little attention. We hear in gospel doctrine class and seminary and even primary the story of Joseph Smith refusing alcohol as a sedative for his leg surgery when he was just 7 years old. And this story is used as an example of how important it is to adhere to the Word of Wisdom's prohibition on alcohol. Even Joseph Smith, before he was visited by the Savior and Heavenly Father, knew how bad alcohol was. And then we talk about how the Word of Wisdom came about, and Emma's disgust in cleaning up tobacco spit kind of being the catalyst for Joseph petitioning God for a revelation and then God giving him the Word of Wisdom, right? As is always the case, when we learn little snippets of Mormon history in church, there's always way more to the story, which renders these lessons completely untrue and reveals them to be whitewashed cult propaganda that they really are. As soon as we dig one layer beneath the surface of these stories, we find a long history of debauchery and intemperance by the prophet. And I've also postulated on this podcast and with my co-authors on multiple papers and in multiple public presentations that this intemperance became a structural and active ingredient in early Mormon spiritual practices. So let's start in the New York period of Joseph Smith's life. And for this period, all I'm going to do is just going to work my way through all volumes of Dan Vogel's series of early Mormon documents. And of course, huge thanks to longtime listener and supporter of the show, Jay Mumford, for sending me this set of 5 books very early on in my research career. They have been an invaluable resource for this podcast. Now, all I've done is go to the index of each of the volumes and looked at the pages listed in the index for Joseph Smith's use of alcohol. There are a lot of page numbers, and there are probably more that aren't, actually listed in the index because indexers miss things sometimes, but we're just going to work from the index, and that's a place to get us started. And we could spend the entire episode today just talking about Joseph Smith Sr., Big Daddy Cheese's alcoholism. And we've already kind of touched on that a few episodes ago, so instead, this is all about Joe and his church. Now, just keep in mind that the alcohol abuse ran in the Smith family. Joseph Smith Sr. was enough of a drunk that when he gave his son Hiram a patriarchal blessing, it included the line, quote, "Thou hast always stood by thy father and reached forth the helping hand to lift him up when he was in affliction. And though he has been out of the way through wine, thou hast never forsaken him nor laughed him to scorn," end quote. As patriarch of the church and patriarch of the Smith family, it's clear that Joe Sr. felt a certain guilt about his alcohol-related vices. Now, if we read deeper into the language there, the eldest brother, Hiram, was the responsible adult of the household who picked up the slack for his alcoholic dad. By the way, it's also interesting that the blessing implies that wine was his drink of choice, but I think this is just stylized biblical language because most of the documentary evidence points to the Smiths drinking whiskey or cider or beer. As we discussed a couple episodes ago, soon after the Smiths moved to New York from Vermont, they started a pushcart business selling cake, cider, and beer. As a reporter described the family business after interviewing a whole bunch of Manchester residents in 1893, quote, "On special days, at general musters, elections, and political meetings, he turned out with the whole Smith family. They pushed their cheap merchandise on sale with cakes, beer, hard cider, and boiled eggs," end quote. And this is the same source that goes on to say that Joe Jr., quote, "was the chief vagabond of this New England gypsy family. Horses, whiskey, craft, and storytelling characterized his worldly career," end quote. So this cake and beer sales business is only the tip of the iceberg, and it's a little counterintuitive if when we hear that story of Joe, refusing alcohol as a sedative for his leg surgery. So let's take a look at general statements made by Smith's neighbors about them being drinkers. And then we can move to more specifics for this period. One 1833 statement signed by 11 Manchester, New York neighbors says the Smiths, quote, "were not only a lazy, indolent set of men, but also intemperate," end quote. In the lingo of the day, intemperate means they drank a lot of alcohol all of the time, as opposed to, the temperance movements working to abolish alcohol, which wouldn't be successful for another century after these statements were made. The term intemperance is going to come up a lot today. Another 1833 statement, which was signed by 51 residents of Palmyra, New York, said the Smiths, and Joe in particular, quote, "were destitute of moral character and addicted to vicious habits," end quote. The vicious habits here that they were referring to could mean an assortment of conduct, but certainly included drinking, right? Joseph Rogers, who lived about 10 miles from Joe in Phelpstown, New York, but also knew Joe and he frequently visited the Palmyra area, said, quote, "he knew at least 100 farmers in the twins of Phelps, Manchester, and Palmyra, New York, who would make oath that Joe Smith, the Mormon prophet, was a liar, intemperate, and a base imposter," end quote. In 1881, William Kelly interviewed Manchester, New York neighbor Mary Bryant, who says, quote, "Smith was a drunkard, but she only knew this by, neighborhood rumor. She actually never saw him drunk." In 1880, a Reverend Chester C. Thorne interviewed Manchester neighbor William Bryant, who had known Joe, quote unquote, to some extent, and said that he was a lazy, drinking fellow, loose in his habits in every way, end quote. Now, Palmyra's Presbyterian pastor, Jesse Townsend, in an 1833 letter, said that he had known Joe for 10 years and considered him, quote, "a person of questionable character, of intemperate habits," end quote. A Dr. Williams, who moved to Palmyra in 1825 and whose reminiscences about the Smiths are recorded in an 1854 book called The California Crusoe, he says that at age 20, Joe was notorious in the neighborhood, quote, "as a drunken, lying, and dissipated young profligate," end quote. So, some pretty general statements, but for some more specifics of Joe's drunkenness, I'm going to start with Orsimus Turner, who lived in Palmyra during his apprenticeship in the printing business in 1818 and 1819. His personal recollection of Joe was that, quote, "he used to come into the village with little jags of wood from his backwoods home, sometimes patronizing a village grocery too freely," end quote. Then Joe would sometimes come into the printing office and lounge around like a quote-unquote inquisitive meddler. And they occasionally blackened his face with ink when he got in the way of their working the printing press. They like it's college or something, drawing a Sharpie dick on his face, right? In the 19th century, by the way, groceries, those were establishments that sold alcohol. So Turner is saying that he remembers that Joe would come into town, buy alcohol, then he would lounge around in the newspaper office, meddling and asking questions. Then he'd get way too drunk, and then they'd paint stuff on his face. And they probably were laughing their heads off while they were doing it. Notably as well, one of Joe's chief resources of fun during this pre-Book of Mormon era was telling fortunes. Now, if you're a village fortune teller looking for information, hanging out in the local newspaper shop and asking questions was the perfect place to get all of the latest gossip for fortune telling and for hot reading, right, as opposed to cold reading. Pomeroy Tucker, another printer who apprenticed in Palmyra, starting in 1820, and he lived there for the next 30 years, similarly said that Joe Sr. used to bring loads of wood into town to trade for whiskey, and the Smith boys, quote, "were frequently seen lounging about the stores and shops in the village," end quote. During this period, the Smiths, quote, were popularly regarded as an illiterate, whiskey-drinking, shiftless, irreligious race of people, end quote, with young Joe, of course, being the worst of the lot. Anna Ruth Eaton, who actually never met Joe but lived in the neighborhood later and knew many of the neighbors, wrote in her 1881 book, The Origin of Mormonism, that as a young man, quote, "Joe never worked save at chopping bees and raisins, and then whiskey was the impetus and the reward," end quote. So he wouldn't work unless he had whiskey with him, and more whiskey was the reward after the work. Local historian Thomas L. Cook, in an 1830 book, tells an amusing story which he apparently heard from a person named Lemuel Durfee, who owned the Smith family's cabin and leased it to them in 1825 and 1826. As part of the Smiths' payment for their lease, Joe worked for Lemuel Durfee during the harvest, and Cook writes of a very humorous example of Joe's intemperance getting the best of him. This is from 1830, very recent after it happened. Quote, "In those days, it was customary to have whiskey, especially through harvest. When the country was new, fever and ague was quite prevalent among the new settlers, and to ward off this malady, nearly every family had a preparation they called number 6 that was made of red peppers and other things that were powerful. Early one morning," that's Thompsonian medicine right there. "Early one morning, while yet in bed, Joseph contemplated the coming day was going to be hot, and was fearful they might have fish for dinner, and as he had always heard that fish would make a man dry. With all this flittering before his imagination, and to ward off the coming danger of a sunstroke, he got out of bed, crept softly downstairs and across the old kitchen into the pantry, but unfortunately he tapped the wrong bottle, and instead of getting whiskey, he took a big swig out of number 6, which nearly strangled him. And upon finding out his mistake, he rushed outdoors to the well, and down went the water bucket. Mr. Durfee, hearing the rumpus, got out of bed to find the cause of this tumult, and upon looking out of the window saw the sainted Joseph strangling and black in the face, trying to drink water out of the old oaken bucket that hung in the well." End quote. So with that number 6 preparation, alcohol being used as a vector for herbal medicine, that's a subject we're going to be discussing extensively in just a few minutes here. Dr. Alexander McIntyre, the Smiths family physician, said in a now lost affidavit that we only have paraphrases of that, quote, "Joe got drunk, stole sugar, got beaten for it, and told the doctor who dressed his bruises that he had had a fight with the devil," end quote. And this probably happened sometime in the mid-1820s when the Smith family was known for farming maple sugar and making molasses. There's a good chance that Joe stole the sugar for the purpose of mixing it in his booze, or to conceal maybe some herbal bitters that are absorbed into the alcohol, because as our next source shows, sugared cider was one of his drinks of choice. Manchester, New York neighbor Barton Stafford said in an 1833 affidavit, quote, "Joseph Smith Sr. was a noted drunkard, and most of the family followed his example, and Joseph Jr. especially, who was very much addicted to intemperance," end quote. And then sometime in 1827, Joe, quote, "One day while at work in my father's field, got quite drunk on a composition of cider, molasses, and water. Finding his legs to refuse their office," I love that phrase so much. "Finding his legs to refuse their office, he leaned upon the fence and hung for some time." Like, come on, we've all been there, right? "At length, recovering again, he felt a scuffling with one of the workmen, who tore his shirt nearly off from him. His wife, who was at our house on a visit, appeared very much grieved at his conduct, and to protect his back from the rays of the sun and conceal his nakedness, threw her shawl over his shoulders, and in that plight escorted the prophet home," end quote. So not only did Joe get so fallen down drunk, he started a fight and ended up half naked, but he had to be covered up and escorted home by his new wife, Emma, thus establishing a long-running pattern of Emma cleaning up for Joe's messes. John Stafford actually told this same story to William Kelly in an interview in 1881, which shows remarkable consistency from, decades apart. He said it was, quote, "Common then for anybody to have a drink in the field those days. One time, Joe, while working for someone after he was married, they had boiled hard cider. Joe came in with his shirt torn. His wife felt bad about it, and when they went home, she put a shawl on him. Had not been fighting. He was a little contentious, but never saw him fight. Known him to scuffle," end quote. So John Stafford wants us to know that Joe didn't rip his shirt in a fight, just a drunken scuffle. I'm not sure what the difference is between those two things. Now, several other members of the Stafford family told similar stories. Christopher Stafford said in an 1885 affidavit, which 1885, that's my favorite year of all time, because that's the first year We saw the first Benz Motorwagen internal combustion automobile. This is what Christopher Stafford said in 1885. Quote, Joe got drunk while we were haying for my uncle, William Stafford, also at a husking at our house and stayed overnight. I have often seen him drunk, end quote. Cornelius R. Stafford said, quote, I have seen Joe in drunken fights. Father and son were frequently drunk, end quote. Joshua Stafford told a story, which we quoted last episode, about Joe trying to borrow a horse so that he could go dig up some treasure. And Joe promised that he would let Stafford take his life if he didn't return the horse. And then Stafford says that Joe was, quote, nearly intoxicated, end quote, during that conversation. David Stafford said in an 1833 affidavit that Joe Sr. was a notorious drunk and gambler, and that Joe Jr., quote, very aptly followed his father's example and in some respects was worse. When intoxicated, he was very quarrelsome. While at work one time, a dispute arose between us, he having drinked a little too freely, and some hard words passed between us, and as usual with him at such times, was for fighting. He got the advantage of me in the scuffle, and a gentleman by the name of Ford interfered. When Joe turned to fighting him, we both entered a complaint against him, and he was fined for the breach of the peace, end quote. Now, in fairness to Joe, we should also tell his side of that story, right? He said in 1842 that the Staffords had set their hog into the Smith's cornfield and that the Smith's dog protected the corn by biting off the hog's ear. David Stafford and 6 other men then shot the dog, and Joe attacked them and single-handedly beat all 6 of these men up. Yeah. Okay, Joe. I'm sure. That's exactly what happened. Yeah, they only got the better of you because the sun was in your eyes, right? Around the same time that he talked to John Stafford, researcher William Kelly also interviewed Hiram Jackway, who said that, quote, Joe and his father got drunk once. It was in the hayfield. Joe and his father wrestled, and Joe threw the old man down, and he cried. They drank cider. They could walk, but they cut up and acted funny, end quote. That was the only time that Jackway remembered ever seeing them drunk. But Jackway later corrected himself in a statement given to John H. Gilbert, the printer of the Book of Mormon, saying he recalled that the Smiths got drunk not on cider, but on whiskey. So, still, they were drunk, right? Another family, the Saunders brothers, gave Kelly mixed reviews of the Smiths drinking. Orlando Saunders, who liked the Smiths and vehemently defended them, said that, quote, everybody drank a little in those days, and the Smiths, with the rest, they never got drunk to my knowledge, end quote. And Orlando's brother, Benjamin Saunders, agreed, quote, it was rulable for people to drink in those times. The Smiths were no worse than others and not as bad as some, but they would take a drink also in haying and harvest, end quote. However, Benjamin Saunders said he never saw them drunk. The third brother, Lorenzo Saunders, said that, quote, them days people drank liquor, everybody drank whiskey, and the Smiths with the rest, end quote. And he recalled a specific incident when Joseph Sr. was drunk in a tavern. So, with all that said, if we simply rely on the correlated narrative that Joseph Smith refused alcohol at age 7 for his leg surgery, and then we skip over everything else by jumping to the Word of Wisdom in 1833, 3 years after he started the church, we could be under the impression that Joe was a temperate fellow. Coincidentally, 1833 is the year that Prudence Crandall, a white woman, was arrested for conducting an educational academy for black women in Connecticut. History's fun, isn't it? Yet, today, when Mormons learn that Joe ordered tobacco and wine just a few hours before the shootout at Carthage, they're amazed. Especially considering the modern Mormon prohibitions on alcohol, right? Well, that's because they don't know Mormon history. And if we consider the statements of all of these neighbors of the Smiths, both friends and enemies, the reality comes into focus. If there was just one statement as an outlier that Joe and that his dad and the other Smiths got drunk, we'd have little reason to believe that one statement. But because account after account demonstrates Joe's love for the drink, with remarkable consistency over decades, even showing different perspectives of the same story given by different people decades apart, no historian in their right mind would conclude that Joseph Smith didn't drink probably pretty frequently. We have so many consistent statements. So why don't we discuss that debauchery at the next level? The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a massive shift in medicine administration methods. Plant medicines, which are ingested by pills or injected into the bloodstream today, back then were mostly infused into topical ointments and alcohol or teas in centuries before that. Yeah, today, like we're talking psychedelics in early Mormonism, as I believe any proper treatment of Joseph Smith and early Mormonism requires. Joe's overconsumption of alcohol requires an examination of what may have been in that alcohol, particularly when it could explain all of the angels and the cool stuff and the gods and like everything that Joseph Smith claimed to have seen. Now, this is a theory of Mormon origins that I've helped to pioneer in a paper that I co-authored with Robert Beckstead, Cody Nakoni, and Michael Winkelman in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. Longtime listeners of the podcast, you already know this, but if you're new to the podcast and you've never heard of this before, it's my pleasure to introduce the Smith entheogen theory to you today. In the most simple terms, the Smith entheogen theory is the idea that Joe and his followers, the visions, the revelations, and the religious experiences, the spiritual manifestations that they had may have been the result of psychedelics. First, let's define the term entheogen, right? It was initially coined by psychedelics researchers in the 1970s to describe any plant which facilitates a specific type of altered state of consciousness. Now, it's used more to refer to a process of using psychedelics rather than to the plant medicines themselves. Psychedelics can be used in non-entheogenic contexts, during which they're just often referred to as party drugs, right? Doing mushrooms with friends and watching a funny movie, that's taking psychedelics, right? Doing mushrooms after a period of fasting and meditation with a babysitter, a face mask to block the light, or a hat with a rock to block the light, relaxing music, and, kind of a debrief session afterwards. That's an entheogenic session in which you're using plant medicines to have a spiritual or mystical experience. The clinical research on entheogens indicates that they are able to produce genuine mystical experiences that are indistinguishable from mystical experiences that occur spontaneously within a religious context. Now, users may experience not only visions, hallucinations, but also sense a union with God, a transcendence of time and space, a connection with sacredness, complete dissolution of ego, a total breakdown of barriers that delineate self from reality. In fact, entheogens have been used in spiritual rituals across the globe for thousands of years. Now, there are basically two parts to the Smith entheogen theory. First, Joe using entheogens himself, right? The dude came up with some crazy stories and he saw some really cool stuff in the woods. If he were tripping, we can not only explain, but we can replicate his experiences. Second, he may have been dosing people in order to get them to have spiritual experiences as well. Now, this is a long time practice of shamans across cultures and centuries, right? I mean, simply put, Joseph Smith founded a religion whose major selling point was the power of the Holy Spirit and personal revelation. Now, ask a Mormon today what's unique about their church. They're going to say modern revelation. We have a living prophet. In early Mormonism, converts experienced dreams, visions, tongues, miracles, spiritual raptures, hallucinations, which are nearly absent from the church today. The power of psychedelics is a missing puzzle piece worth examination that's been overlooked by Mormon history academics for as long as the field has existed. And that's largely because Mormons don't do drugs. And Mormons are also the majority of people who study Mormon history. So the evidence for chemical assistance in these experiences, it points all the way back to 1823 when Joe saw his first angel. Now, this is from Lou B. Cake, a historian who interviewed a lot of people from the South Bainbridge, New York area where Joe lived for a while he was employed by bossman Josiah Stowell. Unfortunately, we don't know who told Mr. Cake this information, so I can't confirm this story. Honestly, this may just be based on a creative misreading of Joe's own official history, but Cake claims that on September 21st, 1823, that's the day that Moroni apparently appeared to Joe and told him about the gold plates, quote, Joe got swore, lied, and swindled contrary to revelation. Joe claims that while in bed, this drunken September 21st, an angel came to him. Whether it was the angel or alcohol that gave Joe the inspiration is the question. Isn't it though? Isn't that the question? For although drunk on September 21st, yet on September 22nd, he claims that he found the plates in the place to which he was directed. End quote. That's from early Mormon documents. Now, I love that line, right? Whether it was the angel or alcohol that gave Joe the inspiration is the question. Indeed, that is the question. And this is a weighty question, which stands at the center of the Smith entheogen theory. And I'm just glad that a contemporary said that as well, right? My point is that we can't measure God, right? Like we can't take one unit of God and put it into a vial to determine its effect on a thing. Any history which posits the variable of God into the hypothesis or even carves out a place for God to be a possibility, that isn't history, it's theology. Since ethical historians don't have access to God when formulating models, naturalistic explanations must be found. You can put 10 milligrams of psilocybin or lysergic acid or dimethyltryptamine or THC or any other entheogen into a vial and measure its effect on a thing. Unlike God, right? You also get similar results among study participants when these variables and other variables are properly controlled for, right? Joe sees angels and gods. How does that happen? We can't replicate his exact experience, but we can replicate the altered state of consciousness, which causes people to hallucinate. Since first publishing and presenting on this topic as Sunstone in 2017, you would be amazed at how many people have walked up to me at subsequent conferences and said that they had their own Sacred Grove experiences with psychedelics. I know that some of you are listening to this right now. So to you few wonderful folks who have shared your stories with me, I say, don't let the ground gnomes steal your treasure. I digress. So back to Joe's early life here. The role of psychedelics in magic and occult traditions is a deep and treasured artifact of post-Enlightenment history. Usage of these plant medicines dates back thousands of years to the Greek classical era, but the Enlightenment brought about the advent of the printing press, and libraries began to fill with books on the occult as well as medical books. And many occult philosophy books carried guidance and instruction, and oftentimes even picture plates for the usage of psychedelics as entheogens, as well as, noting many other nefarious purposes for which plant concoctions could be utilized. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy details extensively these plant medicines. Throughout his work, Agrippa notes the power, quote, an herb with which magicians drinking of can prophesy, end quote. And in chapter 43, which is titled Of Perfumes or Suffumigations, Their Manner and Power, Agrippa actually notes symptomology that's consistent with entheogenic sessions after suffumigating or smoking certain herbs. And they are cited as providing the user with the ability to prophesy, to conjure various spirits with both auditory and visual hallucinations, as well as cause experiences of divine inspiration, all of which are listed as, quote-unquote, celestial gifts. For example, Agrippa says, quote, suffumigations, that's smoking, right? Smoking that is proper to the stars are of great force for the opportune receiving of celestial gifts under the rays of the stars. Suffumigations are wont to be used by them that are about to soothsay or predict for to affect their fancy or conception, which suffumigations, smoking, indeed, being duly appropriated to any certain deities, do fit us to receive divine inspiration. So they say that fumes doth make one to foresee things to come and doth conduce to prophesying. By certain vapors, smoking plants, right? By certain vapors, airy spirits are presently raised, as also thunderings and lightnings and such things. Airy spirits are presently raised, also thunderings and lightnings. Those are hallucinations, visual and auditory hallucinations. He continues, so they say that if henbane and hemlock be made a fume, that spirits will presently come together. Hence they are called spirits' herbs. The juice of hemlock and henbane makes spirits and strange shapes appear. End quote. I mean, the intoxication provided by these plants by smoking them or by infusing them into whiskey or cider, right? They're obviously recognized as a powerful aid in magical operations, and they were clearly utilized as such by the average cunning folk of antebellum America, like Joseph Smith, right? Well, I mean, I guess he's pre-antebellum, Victorian anyway. And whether for conjuration of spirits as, symptomatic of hallucination or for just the general open-minded effects that conduce to prophesying, right? Plant medicines were a functional variable of magical and occult praxis. By 1827, Joe was becoming steadily more steeped in these esoteric arts and traditions. If Joseph Sr. didn't pass this relevant, plant manipulation knowledge to his son, Joe's magic mentors like Lumen Walters, who made their living by selling medicinal potions, would have. After Joe found or he manufactured the plates, right? His drinking didn't stop just because he got the plates and felt that he was called as a prophet, right? And earlier I quoted Joe's employer, Barton Stafford, about Joe getting into a drunken fight in the hayfield sometime after getting the plates. At the end of that account, Stafford goes on to say this, quote, "As an evidence of his piety and devotion, when intoxicated, he frequently made his religion the topic of conversation," end quote. That's quite a striking quote. Joe not only drank a bunch, but probably infused psychedelics into his whiskey. Then he would expound on the mysteries of his personal God and the religion that he was gestating at the time. And this pattern would carry him comfortably into Kirtland, Ohio. In December 1827, Joe moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania to work on the Book of Mormon translation there with not-so-smarty Martin Harris as his scribe. In 1880, reporter Frederick G. Mather interviewed some Harmony, Pennsylvania residents about this period of Joe's life. And these are pretty late reminiscences, but here we go. According to the area's residents, quote, "Joe was in the habit of drinking liquor too freely for the founder of a religion, and perhaps he often mistook a hilarious condition for a very spiritual condition, and undertook to perform on a grand scale very much as other drunken men do, without realizing the magnitude of his task and his own utter inability to perform it," end quote. Now, this quote right here specifically describes a fascinating aspect of psychedelic use. The user has profound experiences, but the sober observer only sees the person acting sporadic or speaking incoherently. And it can become quite hilarious for the observer while simultaneously being the most mystically and spiritually intense experience for the user, complete with hallucinations perceived as angelic visitations or appearances of deity. So Joe didn't limit his drunkenness to when he was off the clock, right? Martin Harris, not so smarty Marty, one of the three witnesses and Joe's personal scribe for this portion of the Book of Mormon translation, he was once tried before a church court in Kirtland, Ohio for telling A.C. Russell that, quote, "Joseph drank too much liquor when he was translating the Book of Mormon, and that he wrestled with many men and threw them, etc., end quote. And Harris defended himself when he was called into that church court hearing, quote, that he did not tell Esquire Russell that Brother Joseph drank too much liquor while translating the Book of Mormon, but this thing took place before the Book of Mormon was translated, end quote. So the High Council then let Martin Harris off with just a chastisement. Now, we hear stories of how Joseph could, wrestle any man and throw them. Turns out he was wasted during most of those fights. Now, Martin Harris walked back this claim about Joe drinking during the translation, right? But the story is confirmed by Harmony, Pennsylvania Constable Levi Lewis. He says, quote, that he saw him, Joe, intoxicated at 3 different times while he was composing the Book of Mormon, end quote. And in fact, Martin's retraction doesn't say that Joe wasn't drunk during translation, right? It just says that Joe didn't drink during translation. The drinking happened beforehand. And Martin's statement about Joe drinking before the Book of Mormon was translated, that's pretty ambiguous, right? You could take it to mean that the drinking happened in an earlier stage of Joe's life, or more likely, you could take it to mean that the drinking happened right before some of their translation sessions. Authoring sessions, since we're, in the milieu of redefining the word translation, why not? Sure, translation, author, they're basically the same words. We know from Lemuel Durfee's account, which I read earlier in the episode, that on at least one occasion, Joe drank whiskey first thing in the morning before a long day of work in the field. So why not before a long day of translation work, right? Lots of artists use plant medicines or, a bit of Grandpappy's old cough medicine to put them in a creative state of mind. Now, Joe continued to drink recreationally as well, right? John H. Gilbert, the Book of Mormon printer, remembered that during the printing, 23-year-old Joe, quote, was a lazy, good-for-nothing lout, chiefly noted for his capacity to hang around a corner grocery and punish poor whiskey, end quote. Punish poor whiskey. He would punish a bottle. And I love that. I love that quote so much. poor whiskey here, that could refer to whiskey of one's own make or extremely low quality whiskey made from doctored alcohol, which means, it was sometimes made with like strychnine and tobacco juice and red pepper and lots of other psychoactive plants and tons of nasty stuff, often downright poisonous stuff. Poor whiskey, right? European settlers during this time, during Joseph Smith's life, sold this nasty stuff to Native Americans at insanely inflated prices, who called it ishkodiwabu, which translates to firewater. Now, in 1830, it's poisonous. It's horrible stuff. So in 1830, we get our first evidence of Joe providing his early converts with a proper shamanic initiation in the form of the church's first miracle. In 1839 history, Joe describes how in early August of 1830, that's just a few months after the church started, Joseph Knight and his wife visited Joe and Emma's home in Harmony, Pennsylvania, so that Joe could confirm them. And confirmation, that's the LDS ritual, which is supposed to convey the gift of the Holy Spirit with all of its, revelatory and miraculous powers, right? This was a great opportunity for Joe to provide the mysteries of the ancients to a skeptical prospective convert. Now, importantly, Joe decided that before the confirmation ceremony, they should all sit down and take the sacrament together. So, Joe left to go buy some wine. But, as Joe was on his way to buy the wine, an angel appeared to him and delivered a revelation, which is now section 27 of the Doctrine and Covenants. The revelation says in part, quote, "It mattereth not what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink when ye partake of the sacrament. Wherefore a commandment I give unto you, that you shall not purchase wine, neither strong drink of your enemies. Wherefore you shall partake of none except it is made new among you. Yea, in this my Father's kingdom which shall be built upon the earth." End quote. The only sacramental wine that the early Mormons were able to take was stuff that Joe made by revelation, according to the words of God in section 27 of the Doctrine and Covenants. You shall not purchase wine or strong drink of your enemies. You shall partake of none except it is made new among you. Joe put a monopoly on the kind of sacrament, the consecrated sacrament that they were able to use. So, after this revelation, after he received this revelation, Joe returned to the house and, quote, "Agreeable to this revelation, we prepared some wine of our own make," end quote. Now, several things to notice here, right? A lot of modern-day Mormons don't realize that the church's current practice of water in little plastic sippy cups for the sacrament, that's not the way things were always done, right? 19th century Christians drank actual wine during communion, and sometimes they drank a lot of it. Section 27 is part of the basis for using water because it says it doesn't matter what you eat or drink, but the revelation actually suggests it isn't water that you should use, it's that you should use wine of your own make. And it's interesting that Joe somehow came up with this wine of their own make on such short notice, right? And as far as I know, there's no other evidence that Joe or his family made their own wine specifically. They were making their own cider and beer. But they did make their own, homebrewed boiled cider, molasses, water, and these other, whiskey and whatever these other stronger drinks were, right? As we heard earlier from Barton Stafford. When Joe says, quote, "We prepared some wine of our own make," end quote, what he actually means is, we used my own homebrew, and who knows what was actually in that bottle, right? And evidence we're going to discuss in a second here makes such an accusation of dosed alcohol very explicit. So during this visit to the Knight family, Joe, I'm just going to let the church tell this story for themselves. And this is from an Ensign article in January 1989. Quote, "While there, Joseph challenged Newell Knight to pray vocally. In the attempt, Newell was attacked by an evil spirit that lifted him from the floor and tossed him about most fearfully. Neighbors gathered and then saw the prophet command the devil in the name of Jesus Christ to depart. Newell felt great relief and gladly accepted baptism. This exorcism was the first miracle performed in the restored church." End quote. From Ensign, January 1989. Now, it's a little bit deeper than that because as Joe actually reported it, quote, I went and found Newell Knight suffering very much in his mind, and his body acted upon in a most strange manner. His visage and limbs were distorted and twisted into every possible shape and appearances, like he was having, convulsions caused by whatever was in the sacrament, right? And finally, he was caught up off the floor of the apartment and tossed about most fearfully. Knight was unable to speak during his convulsions, end quote. Some pretty powerful effects. And then Newell Knight testified about this occurrence during one of the trials in 1830 when Joe was arrested in Colesville. Quote, I felt myself attracted upward and remained for some time enwrapped in contemplation, insomuch that I know not what was going on in the room. By and by I felt some weight pressing upon my shoulder and the side of my head, which served to recall me to a sense of my situation. And I found that the Spirit of the Lord had actually caught me up off the floor and that my shoulder and head were pressing against the beams. End quote. Now, okay. Anybody who's taken psychedelics, listens to that story, and it's like, yeah, he took too much. That was dangerous, right? For people who haven't taken psychedelics, it's like, what is happening here? What is possibly going on? He's convulsing. His limbs are contorted and convulsing. He's unable to speak. He's catatonic. He is apparently lifted up off the floor and being thrown around the room, possibly even breaking some furniture from one of these accounts. Each of these are common descriptions of anticholinergic symptomology. You take too much nightshade like datura, and this is what happens. You take more than this amount, and you're probably going to die. This stuff about him, like levitating, that's what mystics have experienced for millennia. And it's what we call today astral projection, right? The sense of leaving one's body, which can easily be induced via psychedelics and is also sometimes experienced during near-death experiences, right? Later testimonies from Newell, his father, Joseph Knight Sr., and from Martin Harris said that they saw the devil come out of Newell once it was exorcised. And Josiah Stowell at a later date said he saw a devil as large as a woodchuck leave the man and run across the floor. While Newell's dad at a later time said he saw the devil leave the possessed and run off like a yellow dog. Now, I attribute these to either shared hallucinations, which is not uncommon in mass dosings that, we're going to see during the Kirtland temple dedication ceremony, or just later misrememberings of the event, right? Memory can be fabricated. Memories can be fabricated, right? But regardless of this, Newell had a profound mystical experience, which is perfectly explained by Joe providing him with a very, very strong dosage of nightshade. And before this experience, Newell Knight was skeptical. After this, perceived possession and exorcism, after this shamanistic experience with the prophet of God, Newell Knight joined the church and he remained a lifelong member. Joe was in the process of developing a formula that he would implement at larger and larger scales until restricted access to entheogens became a necessity. So let's talk about Kirtland, the entheogenic empire of early Mormonism. Now, a crucial piece of evidence for Mormons being dosed with drugs comes from Kirtland in a December 1830 or January 1831. Now, this is a super interesting factoid. 1831 is also the same year that Michael Faraday publicly demonstrated the electric transformer and generator. A little fun factoid. Now, there's a little bit of background here for this affidavit that we're about to read. Joe had sent some missionaries west in 1830. That was Oliver Cowdery, PQ Parley P. Pratt, John Whitmer, and Ziba Peterson. Now, these guys converted Hinge, Penn, Sidney Rigdon's congregation of Baptists in Kirtland, right? And as soon as they arrived, a whole bunch of really charismatic stuff started happening. And of course, charismatic is a pretty broad term here, right? People were acting like Native Americans under the influence of the Holy Spirit. They were acting out sailing in canoes and scalping people and During these prayer meetings, participants experienced visions, people spoke in tongues, people received their own revelations, so on and so on and so on. It just goes on, right? This all started just a few months before Joe himself got to Kirtland, but right after, the missionaries got out there, right? And I speculate that this small group of handpicked missionaries were trusted with the keys of the priesthood, and they were dosing participants during these prayer meetings. So there was a guy named Jesse Jasper Moss who attended one of these prayer meetings, and he gives us a strong piece of evidence for people being dosed via the sacrament. Soon after the missionaries arrived and converted the Kirtland Church, quote, "They began to have visitations of angels among them. I was suspicious of these angels from the first. When they partook of the sacrament, they always did so at night. In preparation for this, they would exclude everybody from the room but the leaders, and then would hang up blankets and quilts at the windows. When all was ready, they would open the doors and let the people in. I determined to stay through one of their services of the sacrament, so a friend and I went to meeting with that intention. He went to sleep just before the time to exclude the people, and I became possessed of a deaf and dumb devil, and they could not make me understand anything. A deaf and dumb devil." He became catatonic after taking the sacrament, right? He was unable to speak, and when people would speak to him, it didn't make sense to him, right? And he goes on to say, "After a time, they decided to leave us alone and go on with their ceremony. My companion awakened, and we saw the whole performance. I became satisfied that their power was in the wine, so I tried to steal a bottle and would have succeeded if I had been wearing the cloak I usually wore." End quote. Moss explains that he was, quote, "fully satisfied that the wine was medicated," end quote. And the miracles ceased once he started talking about his suspicions and told people how close he had come to stealing the wine. Now, a couple of years after moving to Kirtland, Joe received an important revelation on February 27th, 1833. This is the Word of Wisdom, and it gives guidance on things like diet and substance use. It's currently canonized as Mormon Scripture, Doctrine and Covenants, section 89. And in fact, the Word of Wisdom is so important that your bishop asks you every year about how well you're following the Word of Wisdom. And if they're not satisfied with your level of observance of the cultural interpretation of the Word of Wisdom, then they don't let you into the temple. They make it so you can't go to heaven, right? That is the modern interpretation of the Word of Wisdom, with many departures from the actual text itself. We talked about it at the beginning of the episode, right? Now, it should be noted, the Word of Wisdom didn't just come out of thin air, right? A lot of people at this time were coming up with ideas on diet restrictions, cleanliness, and overall good living, right? Sanitariums were just now starting to trend in the burned over district and elsewhere. And Ellen G. White, Alexander Campbell, William Miller, a lot of other religious leaders were pushing good living or diet restrictions that were just on the verge of becoming popular. Dietary advice was a common topic of discussion in the time that the Word of Wisdom was born out of, right? I mean, this was a time in America where people just weren't healthy and they never bathed and stuff, right? It's not a great time to be alive. But in many ways, these health and diet codes, they were also quite revolutionary because the hygiene and diet of Americans in that time was appalling, right? Meals of pure meat and carbs washed down with beer, whiskey, or coffee or wine, never drinking water, bathing once a month or less, 5 people sharing a bed and getting terrible rest every night. We've come a long way from our smelly and unhealthy past, and that's only very recently that's happened. But there's also another pressure, right? Joe's wife, Emma, according to Bloody Brigham Young in the Journal of Discourses, Volume 12, quote, "When they assembled together in this room after breakfast," this is the School of the Elders, "the first they did was to light their pipes, and while smoking, talk about the great things of the kingdom, and spit all over the room, and as soon as the pipe was out of their mouths, a large chew of tobacco would then be taken. Often the prophet..." Quick point. Nobody who smokes tobacco immediately finishes smoking tobacco out of a pipe and then starts chewing tobacco. That's too much nicotine. You get the shakes, you get nauseous. But if they were smoking something different out of their pipes and then taking the chew of tobacco, that makes more sense to me. Anyway, Brigham continues, quote, Often when the prophet entered the room to give the school instructions, he would find himself in a cloud of tobacco smoke. This and the complaints of his wife at having to clean so filthy a floor made the prophet think upon the matter, and he inquired of the Lord relating to the conduct of the elders in using tobacco, and the revelation known as the word of wisdom was the result of his inquiry. End quote. So Emma was mad at her husband because she had to clean up the floor of the school of the prophets, or the school of the elders, and that was covered in nasty tobacco spit, reeking of spittoons and pipe smoke. Now, that means that it took the wisdom and persistence of his wife to make Joe ask God about how bad tobacco is for you. That's kind of interesting, right? Well, let's read through some of the revelation. It begins, quote, "A word of wisdom for the benefit of the council of high priests assembled at Kirtland, and the church and also the saints in Zion, to be sent greeting, not by commandment or constraint, but by revelation in the word of wisdom, showing forth the order and will of God in the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days, given for a principle with promise, adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints who are or can be called saints." End quote. So this is a really important point, right? Joe appeased Emma by receiving this revelation, but he still left himself plenty of wiggle room to use whatever substances he wanted, right? The revelation very explicitly says this is a recommendation, not a commandment. Now, it's so weird to the church today not only treats the word of wisdom as a commandment, but in fact treats it as one of the most important commandments. And people are known culturally to, if they're Mormons, oh, then you don't drink, you don't ever smoke, right? You don't even drink coffee or tea. It's one of the most culturally identifying things about the church today, right? So on the subject of alcohol and tobacco, the word of wisdom says, quote, "That inasmuch as any man drinketh wine or strong drink among you, behold, it is not good, neither meet in the sight of your Father, only in assembling yourselves together to offer up your sacraments before him." So it's not good in the sight of the Lord, but it doesn't forbid it, right? And it says it's totally cool when you're drinking it for sacrament, right? "And behold, this should be wine, yea, pure wine of the grape of the vine of your own make." Once again, Joe monopolizing who provides the wine, right? "And again, strong drinks are not for the belly, but for the washing of your bodies. And again, tobacco is not for the body, neither for the belly, and it is not good for man, but is an herb for bruises and all sick cattle, to be used with judgment and skill." End quote. So the revelation recommends against wine, strong drink, and tobacco, but then it also goes on to say that hot drinks aren't good for you and that you should eat meat sparingly, except in winter, but wine of your own make is allowed for the purpose of taking sacrament. The revelation also goes on to commend all wholesome herbs. So next time you're at a party and somebody busts out a little baggie of really dank bud, tell them that's some wholesome herb you got there and you're all set. You know, and then of course also all grains, including grain-based mild drinks like beer, are totally cool in the Book of Mormon too. Or the word of wisdom, my mistake. It's weird that Mormons today consider beer to be against the word of wisdom when the revelation explicitly states that beer is cool. And you also won't find modern Mormons taking the part about meat very seriously. Like even the leadership of the church themselves are cafeteria Mormons, only selecting the morsels that they want to follow for completely arbitrary reasons. Now, a notable convert in Kirtland, one of the earliest converts, bears significant consideration here. So when that first group of missionaries passed through Kirtland on their way to Missouri to preach to the native reservations out there, one of the first converts was a guy named Frederick G. Williams, or Freddie Willie, as we call him, episodes 25, 135, and 188. Frequent use of entheogens requires a steady supplier of plant materials. When membership numbers were relatively small and spread out, from 1830 to 1832, right, supplies could have been coordinated by Joseph Smith personally with very little difficulty. He could have gone out into the forest and collected and foraged for all of the plant materials that he needed personally for the few hundred early Mormons. However, as membership grew in Kirtland and Joe's daily activities increased in number and complexity, a rising need for a steady supplier of plant medicines would have increased in correlation with those membership numbers increasing. A number of the early church hierarchy, including the Smiths, the Cowdreys, the Wimmer families in particular, they were deeply invested in the study of pharmaceutical medicine and folk herb craft and the utilization of so-called spirituous liquors. Frederick G. Williams, right? He was a Thomsonian herbal physician practitioner. The guy was born in 1787. He was part of the old guard of Mormons, right? And Williams took up the practice of herbal medicine around 1816 after the death of his sister-in-law during childbirth. Williams gravitated towards Thomsonian medicine, and he was frequently referred to as a herbal or a vegetable doctor. Upon his induction into the religion, Williams was appointed to the office of second counselor to the prophet, having been practicing herbal medicine for over a decade and a half by that point. In 1834, the same year, Dmitri Mendeleev, that's the guy who created the periodic table of elements, was born. The first anti-Mormon book was published under the title of Mormonism Unveiled by Eber D. Howe. Of course, listeners, you can hear the entire audiobook with my commentary on it on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Eber D. Howe attributed the word of wisdom exemption carved out for herbs in the season thereof to Frederick G. Williams's influence on Joe. Howe even obliquely referenced Freddie G. Williams' herbarium on either side of the Kirtland home, of his Kirtland property, while he was disparaging his quote-unquote communion with spirits from other worlds. From Eber D. Howe, Mormonism Unveiled, quote, "We are next told that every wholesome herb God ordained for the use of man, and we should infer that the writer or the recording angel had been inducted into the modern use of herbs by the celebrated Dr. Frederick G. Williams. In Kirtland, F.G. Williams is a revised quack, well known in this vicinity by his herbarium on either side of his house, but whether he claims protection by right of letters, patent from the general government, or by communion with spirits from other worlds, we are not authorized to determine," end quote. Now, another aspect of Freddie G. Willie's involvement in early Mormonism was his missionary journey to proselyte to the Native Americans from late 1830 to 1831. This same missionary troop who converted Williams and Rigdon's Kirtland Church, right, they were told to commence their missionary efforts to preach, quote, on the borders by the Lamanites, end quote. That's Native Americans, right? And that they would scout a location for a satellite arm or a stake of the church to be built in Missouri that would soon become Zion. During this journey, the missionaries met Frederick G. Williams, and he joined with the group to meet with and proselyte to the natives in modern-day Kansas City, Missouri, in a native settlement known as Kaw Township, Missouri. For a botanically centric physician like Frederick G. Williams was, an opportunity to meet with the so-called Lamanites and to intermingle knowledge of herbcraft and, ancient mysticism with the people who had been using American plants for millennia, that would have been an exciting prospect for Frederick G. Williams' medical practice. And it would actually later reflect his newfound knowledge of Indian medicine from this missionary trip. During Williams's mission trip to the Native Americans with this troop of missionaries, right, the Smith family took control of his Kirtland farm as their primary source of income, and Freddie kept track of expenditures and rent under Joseph Smith's name in his own ledger book. By 1834, Joe had run up a gluttonous bill of $4,613 owed to Frederick G. Williams for land and for farming implement use and consumables and many other things. Now, the exact items which ran such a high bill are not listed. Reasonably, $2,000 of that would have just been rent for the farm, right? But we can also be certain that a bill of over $4,600 has plenty of room to include plant medicines, which were frequently being used by Smith and the early Mormon religious practitioners. The debt was forgiven when a revelation was given, but never recorded that all Mormons should forgive all debts, a commandment to which Williams apparently complied. In the medical ledgers of Dr. Williams, specific ailments and the prescribed cures for those ailments are not listed. He was, one of these early adopters of doctor-patient confidentiality. However, the number of visits and the total billings are listed along with the names of the respective patients. So Joe and Hinchman Sidney Rigdon have the highest bills for medicine purchased from Frederick G. Williams. They were his most lucrative clients. An 1835 Kirtland area newspaper ran an advertisement for Frederick G. Williams's medical practice, listing various ailments and frequent Thomsonian cures for those ailments. From 1835, quote, "Vegetable medicine, F.G. Williams, botanic physician. Dr. Williams respectfully informs his old patrons and the public generally that he keeps constantly on hand Dr. Samuel Thompson's vegetable medicine. in all its varieties and will furnish to those who may favor him with their attention at his residence unless otherwise employed nerve powder. One of the most useful remedies for cramps of the stomach and debility of the nerves. It is also good in hysterical and hypochondriacal affections and convulsions. This is an important detail. It may be taken in all cases with perfect safety, without producing the least unpleasant sensation or any deleterious effects upon the system. End quote. Williams had been practicing vegetable or botanic or herbal physician, and knowledge in herbcraft for nearly 2 decades by 1835 when this was published, right? A botanic physician with Williams's level of expertise would know how to produce such nerve powders without unpleasant sensations or deleterious effects, like he stated. However, the inverse is also true. Williams would have been well acquainted with how to produce medicines with those intoxicating effects as well. And of particular note concerning Williams's practice and involvement in Mormonism, it's his essential role at various times that the Mormons were in desperate need of medical attention. After the Mormon exodus to Illinois in the wake of the Missouri-Mormon War of 1838, Williams established his medical practice in Quincy, Illinois, the new Mormon refugee settlement, and he published over 24 ads announcing some details of his practice with, some new information here. Quote, F.G. Williams, Indian and German root doctor, who distinguishes disease by an examination of the urine. He will always apply vegetable medicine, which are perfectly free from all those deleterious effects, which are always the result from the use of mineral medicines. End quote. Look, like the overwhelming logistical constraints of supplying scores or hundreds of Mormons on multiple occasions with proper and with safe psychedelics, those constraints would have been satisfied with an experienced Thomsonian botanical physician like Freddie G. Willie, with his own herbal gardens on his property, which was adjacent to the Kirtland Temple. Now, this may serve to explain motives behind his promotion to the third highest office in the church, second counselor to the president, right? Additionally, as evidence of their close fraternity, Joseph Smith named his own child after Frederick G. Williams. There were those that clearly felt threatened by Freddie's quick and steady rise to Mormon prominence. Some of the medicines that he was administering were declared anathema by Lyman White, who was a high-ranking and militant confidant of Joe. Another high-ranking Mormon, John Corrill, actually entered a complaint against White because White declared that Williams's plant medicines were anathema, and Joe decided to step in and settle the argument. Quote, John Corrill entered a complaint against Lyman White for teaching that, quote, all disease in the church is of the devil, and that medicine administered to the sick is of the devil, for the sick of the church ought to live by faith. The president decided that it was not lawful to teach the church that all disease is of the devil. And if there are any who believe that roots and herbs administered to the sick and all wholesome vegetables which God has ordained for the use of man, if there are any among you that teach that these things are of Satan, such teachings are not of God. End quote. So Joe was defending his wholesome herbs, right? Now, Lyman White must have understood the side effects of some roots and herbs to make this declaration that the medicine is of the devil, right? And while the vast majority of entheogenic sessions were beneficial or were positive or were, included visitations and visions and spiritual manifestations, right? Mormons also had plenty of difficult experiences as well, otherwise called bad trips, which resulted in myriad terrifying exhibitions, episodes 59 and 60. So with increased membership and diversity of attendees in Mormon spiritual experiences, the need for a steady supply of psychedelics also increased, and Freddie G. Willie and all of his knowledge of how to harvest and to cultivate and extract these plant medicines, that provides the most rational supplier for the steady increase in demand with the growing membership numbers. And Williams continued to be a prominent member of the church and a Thomsonian botanical physician until his death in 1842 at the age of 54. His son, Ezra G. Williams, continued the practice of medicine in the absence of his deceased father from that time forward. So the completion of the Kirtland Temple in January of 1836, and that's the same year the Alamo fell, provided the perfect culmination of all of Joe's mystical and esoteric pursuits up to that point. The temple had taken about 3 years and about $40,000 to build. That's about a $1.1 million in 2020 money, right? Its completion was a big deal, and Joe, of course, was ecstatic. On January 23rd, he held a meeting in the temple to ordain his father, Big Daddy Cheese, as patriarch of the church. Now, being ordained into this office required a blessing ritual, during which all of the men of the presidency gathered around Big Daddy Cheese and anointed his head with oil and blessed him. After all the presidency did this, Big Daddy Cheese stood up and returned blessings with anointing oil to all of them, including Joseph Smith. Now, Big Daddy Cheese and the other members of the first presidency, they all laid their hands on Joe's head and they pronounced blessings on him. And then, according to Joe, in his History of the Church, Volume 2, he had a vision. Quote, "The heavens were opened upon us, and I beheld the celestial kingdom of God and the glory thereof. Whether in the body or out, I cannot tell." End quote. Yeah. Anybody who's taking psychedelics, they can agree with that. Whether in the body or out, I cannot tell. Maybe some of you have experienced that as well. Among other things, he saw the gate of heaven. He saw the flaming throne of God. He saw biblical patriarchs and prophets, his dead brother Alvin. He saw his apostles doing missionary work in distant lands, including William McClellan in the South and Brigham Young in the southwestern desert. And he also saw Brigham Young was standing, quote, "upon a rock in the midst of about a dozen men of color who appeared hostile. He was preaching to them in their own tongue, and the angel of God standing above his head with a drawn sword in his hand protecting him, but he did not see it." End quote. Yeah, I'm sure Bloody Brigham was happy to hear that Joe's vision, that he'd be protected in his raging white supremacy by an angel with a drawn sword. That must have been reassuring to good old Bloody Brigham. Now, look, this vision, this experience that Joe described, this could just be Joe lying, as he frequently did, right? Like, his entire legacy is marked by lie after lie after lie, right? Saying that, he had an experience that he didn't really have. But if we consider the influence of psychedelics, this picture comes into greater focus, because Joe wasn't the only one who saw things that day. Here are some more lines from the next few pages of the History of the Church, and let's see if we can't tease out a pattern. Quote, "Many of the brethren who received the ordinance with me saw glorious visions also. Angels ministered unto them as well as to myself. My scribe also received his anointing with us, and saw in a vision the armies of heaven protecting the saints in their return to Zion, and many things which I saw. The bishop of Kirtland with his counselors, and the bishop of Zion with his counselors, were present with us, and received their anointings under the hands of Father Smith. And this was also confirmed by the presidency, and the glories of heaven were unfolded to them also. Hiram Smith anointed the head of the president of the counselors in Kirtland, the president David Whitmer, the head of the president of the counselors of Zion. The president of each quorum then anointed the heads of his colleagues, each in turn, beginning at the oldest. The visions of heaven were opened to them also. Some of them saw the face of the Savior, and others were ministered unto by holy angels, and the spirit of prophecy and revelation was poured out in mighty power." End quote. So these guys were each anointed, and in turn, and after being anointed, and they each had visions, at least according to Joe. The heavens were opened to them. They saw the face of the Savior. They saw holy angels. And then the next day, it all happened again with even more people in the room. Quote, "In the evening we met at the same place with the Council of the 12 and the presidency of the 70, who were to receive this ordinance of anointing and blessing. After calling to order and organizing, the presidency proceeded to consecrate the oil." To consecrate the oil. To consecrate the oil. What does that mean? "We then laid our hands upon Elder Thomas B. Marsh, who is president of the 12, and ordained him to the authority of anointing his brethren. I then poured the consecrated oil upon his head in the name of Jesus Christ, and sealed such blessings upon him as the Lord put into my heart. He then anointed and blessed his brethren from the oldest to youngest. The heavens were opened, and angels ministered unto us. Then the 12 proceeded to anoint and bless the presidency of the 70, and seal upon their heads power and authority to anoint their brethren. The heavens were opened unto Elder Sylvester Smith, and he, leaping up, exclaimed, "The horsemen of Israel and the chariots thereof! The gift of tongues fell upon us in mighty power. Angels mingled their voices with ours, while their presence was in our midst, and unceasing praises swelled our bosoms for the space of half an hour." End quote. No, I think the term consecrated oil, I think that's a key, right? I think that's a code word for oil, which contained the keys to the kingdom of the gospel, psychedelics, right? Keys to the kingdom of gods, the council of gods, right? Like, these guys were getting anointed, and then almost immediately after, they're seeing angels in heaven. They're seeing visions of heaven itself. They're seeing chariots. They're speaking in foreign languages that they've never learned, which to a sober-minded observer would probably just look like mumbling and not actual any languages, right? And in all, there are 14 references to anointing oil and 26 references to visions or to seeing angels or seeing things like these hallucinations in just a few pages of the history of the church, and all in just a 2-day period. Historian Alexander Baugh has compiled over 70 such spiritual and visionary experiences in just the first 7 years of the church's existence. That's a striking pattern. Almost every time Joe was anointed with this consecrated oil on his head, or other people were, the heavens opened up to them. They had visions. They heard God speaking. And then Joe's were considered authoritative and written down as revelations, right? And almost every time somebody else was anointed in the same way, they had that same oil that was put on their head, just like Joe. They saw those visions. They saw the angels. The heavens opened up to them. And topical oils are fantastic vehicles for psychoactive plant medicines, especially when they're poured directly onto a person's head. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind here is the public perception of drugs that we have today is wildly different than how drugs were perceived back in the 19th century. Drugs didn't carry the taboos and stigmas of today. To view them as such in the 19th century is presentist. It's a fallacy. For many users, plant medicines, like psychedelics, they were just God's gift to bring you to enlightenment, right? Agrippa's standard-bearing 3 books of occult philosophy circa 1533, quote, "God himself, who being unchangeable, distributes to everyone as he pleaseth. All virtues, therefore, are infused by God," end quote. A person would go walking through the forest. They would pick up some psilocybin or cut the tops off of cactus and then refine them into a powder or infuse them into alcohol or, mix them into an oil, a topical ointment. And then they would imbibe those chemicals in order to speak with God or to see angels or to prophesy or to connect with the Holy Spirit. Simple as that. Like, it wasn't a Schedule 1 drug that the person would go to jail for having on their person. It was just one of God's many gifts that help us get closer to him or understand God's mind. Now, it may sound degrading to Joe and his friends to think that they were just tripping whenever they came up with revelations, right? But that's only because of the negative stigma that drugs carry today. When we consider all aspects and possibilities of Joe using entheogens to come up with revelations and to have these spiritual experiences and to see visions, hallucinations of angels and God, right? Suddenly we have naturalistic explanations for this visionary era of early Mormonism. Also, it's not like Joe himself didn't have access to drugs like this, right? He wasn't snorting Colombian cocaine that he used church funds to buy a kilo off of this one guy, right? The oil that they used for topical ointments for this consecrated oil, it was likely from plants that they found locally in the forests of New York and Ohio, or they cultivated in Frederick G. Williams herbariums, right? I'm up in Seattle, and it's fungus country up here. Anybody can go walking through the forest, especially in late September, and find a couple caps of magic mushrooms. They're everywhere. Joe likely had ready access to psychedelic oil or sacrament, or whether it was by his own findings or from a local salesperson that was making the oil to sell to Joseph Smith, like Frederick G. Williams, right? Joe spent a lot of time playing in the woods near his home, growing up in New England. Mushrooms and all sorts of psychedelic plants grow all over in New England. When I was in Palmyra presenting on the Smith entheogen theory at the John Whitmer Historical Association conference last September, I found a ton of different mushrooms, and I even found a belladonna plant, a member of the nightshade family and powerfully psychedelic, in the sacred grove itself. Some of the mushrooms were even guarded by a toad, and he was a friendly little treasure guardian who didn't mind being patted on the head. Episode 176. Now, there were even more of these sorts of visions a few months later. At the dedication of the finished temple on March 27, 1836, the dedication service for the Kirtland Temple was held in the main chapel area of the temple. It was 8 hours long, and there are stories floating around of angels and spirits flying through the building during the service, and auditory hallucinations from sound of rushing mighty winds, and just, all kinds of, perceived miraculous events. In the morning, anywhere from 250 to 1,000 people gathered in the temple. The records are a little shady. And Joe had encouraged everybody to fast the night before the ceremony, which is important. It just heightens the effectiveness of whatever chemical they are ingesting through the sacrament. Now, according to Joe's own account of this event in the History of the Church, Volume 2, quote, Brother George A. Smith arose and began to prophesy when a noise was heard like the sound of a rushing mighty wind which filled the temple, and the congregation simultaneously arose, being moved upon by an invisible power. Many began to speak in tongues and prophesy. Others saw glorious visions, and I beheld the temple was filled with angels, which fact I declared to the congregation. According to Oliver Cowdery's Kirtland, Ohio sketchbook, quote, the Spirit was poured out. I saw the glory of God like a great cloud come down and rest upon the house, and fill the same like a mighty rushing wind. I also saw cloven tongues like as of fire rest upon many, for there were 316 present, while they spake with other tongues and prophesied. End quote. And no one else's account of this event is quite as sensational as Smith's and Cowdery's, but people did speak in tongues. They saw visions. They saw angels. George A. Smith claimed in the Journal of Discourses, Volume 11, that David Whitmer saw 3 angels walking up the aisle, although Whitmer himself described the ceremony as a quote-unquote grand fizzle and said there was no visitation that day. It's all a matter of perspective, right? Who has a sober mind? Who has a mind that is in an altered state of consciousness because of the sacramental wine that they partook of, right? George A. Smith, unfortunately, kind of had a habit of making things up, so maybe he's not really credible on this, right? But more credible is Truman Angel's autobiography, which says that Frederick G. Williams, our buddy Freddie G. Williams, with his herbarium on either side of his house, quote, rose and testified that midway during the prayer, an holy angel came and seated himself in the stand, end quote. Joseph Smith then explained that the angel was none other than the resurrected apostle Peter, quote, come to accept the dedication, end quote. And according to Benjamin Brown in his article Testimony of the Truth, hundreds of elders spoke in tongues. Now, I have to ask, was this so epic because the Spirit of God was coursing through the halls of this temple? Or was it because another spirit was coursing through everybody's veins? Right? The wine of Joe's own make being consecrated with the keys to the kingdom seems to explain a few other accounts, and here are just some of those accounts that didn't make it into the church's official histories. According to William Harris, when the attendees broke their fast by eating the bread and drinking wine, Joe, quote, encouraged the brethren to drink freely, telling them that the wine was consecrated and would not make them drunk. They began to prophesy, pronounce blessings upon their friends and curses on their enemies. If I should be so unhappy as to go to the regions of the damned, I would never expect to hear language more awful or more becoming the infernal pit than was uttered that night. Alfred Morley said that he heard many Mormon attendees, quote, say that very many became drunk. The Mormon leaders would stand up to prophesy and were so drunk that they could not get it out and would call for another drink. Over a barrel of liquor was used at the service. Isaac Aldrich said his brother, 70s president Hazen Aldrich, described the dedication as a drunken powwow. Stephen H. Hart said a Mormon named Mr. McWithy told him, quote, The Lord's Supper was celebrated, and they passed the wine in pails several times to the audience, and each person drank as much as he chose from a cup. He said it was mixed liquor, and he believed the Mormon leaders intended to get the audience under the influence of the mixed liquor, so that they would believe it was the Lord's doings. When the liquor was repassed, Mr. McWithy told them he had endowment enough and said he wanted to get out of the temple, which was densely crowded, end quote. Now, remember, everyone had fasted before this ceremony, and we all know what happens when you drink mixed liquor or consecrated sacramental alcohol, or, when you imbibe in psychedelics on an empty stomach, right? And it's also notable that in occult and religious traditions prior to these visionary manifestations, that fasting is an integral piece. Shamans who lead people through psychedelic journeys will often encourage attendees to fast before partaking of the journey. William McClellan pointed this out in a July 1872 letter, quote, "Some partook so freely on their empty stomachs that they became drunk. I took care of Samuel H. Smith," that's Joe's younger brother, "in one of the stands, so deeply intoxicated that he could not nor did sense anything. I kept him hid from the crowd in the stand, but he vomited the spit box 5 times full, and his dear brother Don Carlos would empty it out the window." End quote. These are not the stories that we hear in church about the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony, right? And in a couple of other letters, William McClellan reiterated this story of taking care of Samuel Smith and emphasized that, quote, "the endowment of power," end quote, "that the saints had expected to receive turned out to be a farce." Quote, "No display of power from God was given. All the power given was the power of man," end quote. He's acknowledging that a power was there, but it was a power of man, not of God. And if we read this through an entheogenic lens, this is McClellan, Professor Bill in our timeline, stating outright that whatever the attendees experienced that day had a naturalistic explanation. It was the power of man that did it. The dedication ceremony of the Kirtland Temple, it's truly a remarkable occurrence in early Mormonism, and it's held up as a faith-promoting manifestations of angels and God by believers today. And it's rationalized in different ways by historians as group hallucinations and shifty record-keeping, yet I think it's the perfect example staring us right in the face that psychedelics were clearly present in the early church. Sometimes the easiest and most simplistic answers are hiding in plain sight. And according to the Smith entheogen theory, Joe liked his psychedelics to help with prophecy and conjuration of spirits, but he also didn't mind a bit of rudimentary partying that alcohol provides. And even though Joe explicitly said in the Word of Wisdom that it wasn't a commandment, right? The church voted to take a covenant to follow the Word of Wisdom, which functionally made it a commandment. Joe, however, wasn't really on board with the covenant that the church made, and he continued to drink alcohol recreationally as well. And this caused some problems for the church. For instance, August 19th, 1835, the Kirtland High Council held a disciplinary hearing for Almon Babbitt on charges that included not keeping the Word of Wisdom. Babbitt defended himself by saying, quote, that he had taken the liberty to break the Word of Wisdom from the example of President Joseph Smith and others, but acknowledged that it was wrong, end quote. That's according to the history of the church, that Almon Babbitt was called into a disciplinary council because he was drinking, and he said, well, I know that drinking is wrong, but I'm just following the example of the prophet. Follow the prophet, don't go astray. Now, just how intense was Joe's recreational binge drinking during this period? Well, here's an affidavit from a guy named G.B. Frost, which is published in John Bennett's 1842 Expose of Mormonism, which patrons can hear the whole thing along with my commentary on the Patreon exclusive feed. That's History of the Saints. Quote, on or about the middle of June 1837, I rode with Joseph Smith Jr. from Fairport, Ohio to Kirtland. When we left Fairport, we had been drinking pretty freely. I drank brandy, he brandy and cider both together. And when we arrived at Painesville, we drank again. And when we arrived at Kirtland, we were very drunk. About the last of August 1837, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others were drunk at Joseph Smith Jr.'s house all together, and a man by the name of Vincent Knight supplied them with rum, brandy, gin, and port wine from the cash store, and I worked in the loft overhead. He, Joseph, told Knight not to sell any of the rum, brandy, gin, or port wine, for he wanted it for his own use. They were drunk and drinking for more than a week." End quote. Essentially, Joe considered his own word of wisdom revelation to be more like guidelines than actual rules. Welcome aboard the Red Carbuncle, dear listener, with Captain Joe Bar Bossman at the helm. Now, I don't have a whole lot of information about Joe using intoxicants, whether psychedelics or just, straight up alcohol in Missouri in 1838, because he wasn't there for very long. But we do know that although the Mormon government had banned the sale of alcohol in Caldwell County, Missouri, Smith opened a hotel and tavern in Far West, a business model that he would revive in Nauvoo. In June of 1838, the same year that John Wilkes Booth was born, the Far West High Council had to remind Joe's family that there was a ban on the sale and consumption of ardent spirits in that place. According to the council's minute book, Joe complied with the request to stop selling liquor, at least above the table. Joe had similar problems in Nauvoo, Illinois. In February 1841, just a month after Hong Kong was ceded to the British Commonwealth, Joe's left-hand man, John C. Rackett Bennett, took his office as first mayor of Nauvoo. Bennett was a teetotaler, and in a speech to the city council, he urged this council in no uncertain terms to prohibit and suppress all businesses that sold alcohol in the city, but they had to play catch up. So the council took his advice, and in the history of the church, we can read that the ordinance that they passed, quote, that all persons and establishments, whatever in this city, are prohibited from vending whiskey in a less quantity than a gallon or other spirituous liquors in a less quantity than a quart to any person whatever, excepting on the recommendation of a physician, like Frederick G. Williams. End quote, right? I added the like Frederick G. Williams, right? Breach of the ordinance was punishable by a fine of up to $25, which is a huge fine at the time. Now, Nauvoo Mormonism experienced an influx of temperance advocates, chief of which was John C. Bennett, who became fast friends with the prophet. The Mormons were already known to be a temperate sect, and the majority didn't oppose a temperance bill that was proposed in 1840 by Bennett. And deliberating over that bill before they passed it during the church conference, Joe carved out this important exception, quote, "In the discussion of the foregoing bill, I spoke at great length on the use of liquors and showed that it was unnecessary and operates as a poison in the stomach, and that roots and herbs can be found to effect all necessary purposes." End quote. All necessary purposes. I mean, hey, go ahead, take my whiskey away, but don't take my herbs, my wholesome herbs in the season thereof, right? Now, publicly, liquor in Nauvoo was tightly controlled by the city government. Medicinal liquor infused with bitters or herbs enjoyed an exemption from that abolition. The disparity between public abolition of liquor and private usage among Mormon elites was also occasionally noted by those who were unaware of the approval of medicinal liquor versus the public opposition to recreational use of the same spirituous beverages. During a mission trip in 1839, Brigham Young and George A. Smith traveled the countryside, and they boarded with fellow brethren in the covenant. During a particular stay, both George A. Smith and Brigham Young were suffering from illness, and they carried with them medicinal liquor infused with bitters, which didn't escape the comment from a Mormon named Father Draper with whom they were boarding. Quote, "We went into the house. Brother George A. Smith dropped onto the hearth a bottle containing some tonic bitters, which the brethren had prepared for us because of our sickness. At this, Father Draper was very much astonished and said, 'You are a pretty set of apostles to be carrying a bottle of whiskey with you.' We explained to him that what it was. This appeased his righteous soul so that he consented to have us stay over the night." End quote. Now, the brethren preparing their own tonic bitters must not have been out of the ordinary for bloody Brigham Young. The exercise of divine healing throughout Mormon history may not be attributable to the, supernatural for historians, but to the bitters that are infused in medicinal tonics and liquor and consecrated topical oils that were employed throughout its entire 19th century history. So for drinkers like Joe, who lived in Nauvoo, The prohibition ordinance wasn't too onerous because they could always just go across the river to Montrose to buy their booze. Now, token anti-Mormon Tom Ass Coke Sharp noted in his paper, The Warsaw Signal, on July 14th, 1841, that Joe was publicly seen while he was on drinking benders. Quote, even the prophet himself, although a seeming devotee of the temperance cause, is a better friend to Bacchus than to any other god, except perhaps Plutus, which is the god of wealth. So, good one, Thomas Sharp. I love it. We have heard of 3 sprees of his in the last 10 months. In the first, he appeared amongst his followers and offered to prove the truth of his mission by a miracle, which was to climb a hickory pole 60 feet high with the bark off, heels upward. The second, he's going to pole dance to prove that he's a prophet? Okay. The second was on board the steamer Nauvoo in her excursion to Bloomington last fall. On this occasion, His Holiness drank whiskey until he found himself on his back, feeling upwards for the ground, so says our informant. The third was last week. On this occasion, it does not appear that Joe was exactly drunk, but it seemed strange to see the prophet of the Lord at the head of a champagne party, crying lustily, "Take away the empty bottles and bring on the full ones." Verily, our modern prophet is the very beau ideal of a pious Christian. How abstemious, how self-denying, but this is none of our business. We shall not turn preacher, however much the occasion may require it. End quote. I just love Thomas Sharp so much. The Warsaw Signal is such a fantastic newspaper, and you can find the entire archives online. In show notes of past episodes where we've read through Thomas Sharp, just search the show notes for the Warsaw Signal. You'll find links to all of the articles that we've read on the show. Another article on July 21st in the Warsaw Signal, Thomas Sharp noted that Bennett and Smith had visited Warsaw, and inside their carriage was a decanter containing some kind of alcohol. According to Sharp, quote, half a mile from town, the prophet and suit halted and took a regular swig, doubtless by way of inspiration, end quote. By way of inspiration. Thus saith the Lord, bring on the full bottles. I love it. Now, it's not clear if Joe was, buying his booze in Montrose, or if he was getting it some other way, or maybe if Pistol Pack and Porter was, bootlegging it into the city. Who knows, right? But here's one possible way he might have gotten it. In enforcing the city ordinance, the Nauvoo Legion busted up several Nauvoo grog shops and groceries. As both Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion and Chairman of the City Council's, for regulating spirituous liquors, Joe was in a position to decide what was done with the alcohol that was seized from these shops. Not long after this, Joe would have his own bar in the Nauvoo mansion. Meanwhile, Joe was also working to roll back the church's covenant to treat the word of wisdom as a commandment. In November 1841, he preached a sermon at the Nauvoo Temple lot in which he said that, quote, what many people called sin was not sin, end quote. And he specifically used the example of Noah getting drunk in the Bible and his son laughing at him. And in this story, Noah is the drunkard and Ham is the temperance advocate, but God takes Noah's side, not Ham's. Ham and all his descendants get cursed with the dark skin. So implicitly, anyone who criticizes Joe for getting drunk is going to be cursed like a modern-day Ham, right? And plenty of Bible passages can be mined for anybody looking for a debauchery-filled lifestyle. After this sermon, the high priest's quorum and the quorum of the 12 met together and agreed that, quote, a forced abstinence was not making us free, but had rather placed the church under bondage with a yoke upon our necks, end quote. And we're like, just let the free market of religion, sort it out. We don't want people to feel like our religion is infringing on their American freedoms, like being able to drink. But and just like that, right? The word of wisdom officially stopped being a commandment for the church in Nauvoo. It wouldn't be until the Prohibition era in the early 20th century under Heber J. Grant's leadership that the word of wisdom became heavily enforced and alcohol became prohibited in Mormon culture. I mean, That's 70 to 80 years after this stuff is going on in Nauvoo, right? Now, later, during the Nauvoo period, Joe often recorded himself drinking in his journals or in the history of the church. For instance, May 3rd, 1843, he, quote, drank a glass of wine with Sister Janetta Richards, made by her mother in England, end quote. January 29th, 1844, Captain White of Quincy was at the mansion last night and this morning drank a toast. On June 1st, 1844, Joe drank a glass of beer at Moiser's. On June 27, 1844, Dr. Richards uncorked the bottle and presented a glass to Joseph, who tasted. After Joe replaced Bennett as mayor, Joe also loosened up the city's regulation of the sale of alcohol. March 10, 1843, quote, Joseph decided that he had no objection to having a brewery put up by Theodore Turley, end quote. Joe also had his own bar in his own house, as recorded in the History of the Church, Volume 6, quote, be it ordained by the City Council of Nauvoo that the mayor, Joe, of the city is hereby authorized to sell or give spirits in any quantity as he in his wisdom shall judge to be for the health and comfort or convenience of such travelers or other persons as shall visit his house from time to time, end quote. It seems like Joe finally was able to kind of wrestle back the reins and took control of both the church's and the city's alcohol policy from the teetotaler wing of the church. And notably, like, we also talk about the bar in the Nauvoo mansion and Emma not being happy about that and her forcing Joe to remove the bar. Well, Porter Rockwell just set up a bar across the street from the Nauvoo mansion. So people would just go get drunk at Porter Rockwell's bar across the street, and then they would go to the Nauvoo mansion to sleep for the night and serve their other carnal desires. So, in a context of everything we have discussed so far, Reckitt Bennett requires a deeper examination beyond just alcohol prohibitions that he was able to push through the Nauvoo City Council. He, just like Freddie G. Willie, was an herbal physician, but Bennett also had some training in obstetrics. Now, many allegations float around Nauvoo about Bennett performing abortions in order to keep polygamy secret. Bennett also ran a brothel in Nauvoo, and if you're somebody who runs a brothel without any system of birth control, your business practices are pretty short-sighted. Now, these rumors are so salacious that you hope they aren't true, but so prevalent that you can't help but think they might be true. We've discussed them on the show, episode 141. But facets of polygamy is another aspect of herbal medicine which bears discussion here. Now, of specific note during the Nauvoo era of Mormonism was the increased practice of polygamy. And, a tenet that was previously reserved for Joe exclusively while the Mormons were in Ohio and Missouri, Nauvoo provided a safe haven for Mormon elites to begin taking additional wives as well. When the Mormon aristocracy finally controlled the government and the city courts, illegal and nefarious conduct became the norm. A great deal of conflict arose as a result of rumors of adultery gripping this new Mormon settlement. And Joe took anywhere from like 33 to 48 wives before his death, depending on what sources and what historians are given more credibility, as well as what criteria are used to determine, marriage ceilings. Now, we're going to discuss polygamy more in a coming episode of this series, but we're going to round out today's episode with a brief discussion of herbal medicines associated with polygamy. And this is going to get pretty dark, but it's an aspect of coercion and abuse that deserves the light of day. A wholly undiscussed aspect of Mormon polygamy revolves around the use of so-called love filters to acquire wives and abortifacients to conceal the results. So first, let's talk about love filters. As occult historian Thomas Hatsis, observed, quote, otherwise known as a love filter, a poculum amatori, literally love cup, was both a stupefacient and an exciter that impaired the senses and stirs within apparitions and frenzied loves, end quote. These love filters, love potions, are an often addressed topic in the same occult source material that was used by Joe and the Smith family for all of their money-digging operations, and the combined ingredients of such potions often elicit mind-altering effects similar to that of MDMA or of ecstasy, making physical touch and specifically intimate physical touch very, very excitable. But there's more to it, right? The clandestine application of these love filters would have produced pliable and willing participants to polygamous unions who otherwise had been objectionable or opposed to these practices, to more open systems, or let's say non-conventional systems of marriage. Let's say experiments in non-monogamy. Additionally, evidence for these entheogenic applications, as well as the often necessary abortifacients, which were then used to cover up the inevitable side effects of the love filters, that's a subject that's really been unexplored by any Mormon historian. Joe, in particular, was noted for sometimes forcibly coercing his more obstinate prospective wives with threats of vengeful angels wielding swords should the unions not proceed as decreed by the one true prophet. One of these women, quote, Zina D. Huntington, told of Brother Joseph's remark in relation to the revelation on celestial marriage, how an angel came to him with a drawn sword and said if he did not obey this law, he would lost his priesthood. And in keeping of it, he, Joseph, did not know, but it would cost him his life, end quote. So not only would this story provide a horrendously effective set and setting for later proposals, but this also provided the addition of love filters, right? Because these pre-programmed hallucinations of angels, sometimes angels with swords, right? They would have undoubtedly assured that these women would eventually relent to Joe's advances. Of his 33 to 48 polygamous wives, many were already married to other church officials. In one case, Zina B. Huntington, she was even 7 months pregnant when they were sealed. And at least 7 of these women were teenagers. They were children at the time of their quote-unquote celestial marriage to Joseph Smith. So, to reiterate what I'm saying here, Joe could tell a young woman that he wanted to marry, that an angel appeared to him with a drawn sword and commanded them to be sealed. Then Joe could dose them with a love filter or a psychedelic, and the programming that he provided for them would cause so much anxiety, and it would occupy their mind so much that when the psychedelic or the love filter took effect, that effect would manifest as an apparition of sorts to the young woman, and it would confirm to her that the angel wants them to get married. As a case study, I offer the words of Lucy Walker, a teenage victim of Joseph Smith. She details how Joe began to target her, then teach her about the concept of celestial marriage. Then she denied him. Then Joe blessed her that she would receive the confirmation of the Spirit that celestial marriage was of God and that Joe indeed was a prophet of that same God. Lucy apparently received this confirmation late at night with a very incredible experience, which could have easily been the result of a love filter or, a psychedelic like this. During the time she describes here, Lucy's mother had recently died, and her father was in the eastern states on a mission for Joe. She was functionally an orphan in Nauvoo. And I'm going to let Lucy speak for herself from 1888 when she recorded this reminiscence. And then 1888 is the same year that Kodak was founded and that California got its first seismograph. So here we go. Lucy Walker, quote, In the year 1842, President Joseph Smith sought an interview with me and said, I have a message for you. I've been commanded of God to take another wife, and you are the woman. My astonishment knew no bounds. This announcement was indeed a thunderbolt to me. He asked me if I believed him to be a prophet of God. Most assuredly I do, I replied. He fully explained to me the principle of plural or celestial marriage. He said this principle was again to be restored for the benefit of the human family, and that it would prove an everlasting blessing to my father's house and form a chain that could never be broken, world without end. What have you to say? He asked. Nothing. How could I speak, or what could I say? He said, If you will pray sincerely for light and understanding in relation thereto, you shall receive a testimony of the correctness of this principle. I thought I prayed sincerely, but was so unwilling to consider the matter favorably that I fear I did not ask in faith or light. Gross darkness, instead of light, took possession of my mind. I was tempted and tortured beyond endurance until life was not desirable. Oh, that the grave would kindly receive me, that I might find rest on the bosom of my dear mother. Why should I be chosen from among thy daughters, Father? I am only a child in years and experience, no mother to counsel. She died in January of 1841, just a few months before this. No father near to tell me what to do in this trying hour. He was on a mission to a warmer climate to help his health. Oh, let this bitter cup pass, and thus I prayed in the agony of my soul. The prophet discerned my sorrow. He saw how unhappy I was and sought an opportunity of again speaking to me on this subject and said, "Although I cannot under existing circumstances acknowledge you as my wife, the time is near when we will go beyond the Rocky Mountains, and then you will be acknowledged and honored as my wife." He also said, "This principle will yet be believed in and practiced by the righteous. I have no flattering words for you. It is a commandment of God to you. I will give you until tomorrow to decide this matter. If you reject this message, the gate will be closed forever against you." This aroused every drop of scotch in my veins. For a few moments, I stood fearless before him and looked him in the eye. I felt at this moment that I was called to place myself upon the altar, a living sacrifice perhaps, to brook the world in disgrace and incur the displeasure and contempt of my youthful companions. All my dreams of happiness were blown to the four winds. This was too much, for as yet no shadow had crossed my path aside from the death of my dear mother, which happened 3-4 months before this was going on. Timing is everything, right, Joe? The future to me had been one bright, cloudless day. I had been speechless, but at last found utterance and said, "Although you are a prophet of God, you could not induce me to take a step of so great importance unless I knew that God had approved my course. I would rather die. I have tried to pray, but received no comfort, no light, and emphatically forbid him speaking again to me on this subject. Every feeling of my soul revolted against it," said I. "The same God who has sent this message is the being I have worshipped from my early childhood, and he must manifest his will to me." He walked across the room, returned, and stood before me with the most beautiful expression of countenance and said, "God Almighty bless you. You shall have a manifestation of the will of God concerning you, a testimony that you can never deny. I will tell you what it shall be. It shall be that joy and peace that you never knew." Oh, how earnestly I prayed for these words to be fulfilled. It was near dawn after another sleepless night when my room was lighted up by a heavenly influence. To me it was, in comparison, like the brilliant sun bursting through the darkest cloud. The words of the prophet were indeed fulfilled. My soul was filled with a calm, sweet peace that I never knew. Supreme happiness took possession of me, and I received a powerful and irresistible testimony of the truth of plural marriage, which has been like an anchor to the soul through all the trials of life. I felt that I must go out into the morning air and give vent to the joy and gratitude that filled my soul. As I descended the stairs, President Smith opened the door below, took me by the hand, and said, "Thank God, you have the testimony. I too have prayed." He led me to a chair, placed his hands upon my head, and blessed me with every blessing my heart could possibly desire. The first day of May 1843, I consented to become the prophet's wife, and was sealed to him for time and all eternity at his own house by Elder William Clayton. End quote. Lucy added a few notable details in another account, which was reported secondhand. In this version, she adds that an angel came in. She also adds the fact that she was living in the Smith home when this happened, and that she had this angelic manifestation after eating dinner, providing a window for her to have been surreptitiously drugged by the prophet, which would have induced her mind into a state of consciousness where she was expecting this angelic manifestation. Quote, "I went to live with Joseph Smith's family as a maid, and after I had grown up, Joseph asked me if I would marry him. I felt highly insulted, and he said that if I wanted to know whether the principle was true, I could go to God and find out. One night after supper, I went out into the orchard, and I kneeled down and prayed to God for information. After praying, I arose and walked around the orchard and kneeled again and repeated this during the night. Finally, as I was praying the last time, an angel of the Lord appeared to me and told me that the principle was of God and for me to accept it." End quote. Lucy was 17 when this happened. Joe was 38. Notably, Joe's personal herbal physician, second counselor in the presidency and namesake of one of Joe's sons, Frederick G. Williams, included in his medical ledger book charges for men in Nauvoo for one of his remedies that he called a bachelor's delight. According to Freddie G. Willie's biographer, a descendant by the same name, quote, although the reference is veiled in a euphemistic phrase, Dr. Williams, it would seem, treated some patient or patients for venereal disease, which he listed as bachelor's delight in his medical ledger, page 33. There are a total of 25 separate billings totaling $41.87, which was paid off August 1st, 1839, with the notation sundries to balance, end quote. The biography then goes on to list Thomsonian medical cures for venereal diseases, including syphilis, but the biographer doesn't exactly describe how he made the jump from Williams' ledger book calling Bachelor's Delight a tincture of some sort to it being a cure for venereal disease. It's merely an assumption that he made. I postulate that love filters, certain plant medicines acting as stupefacents or as exciters to put the people in, to put the prospective women into altered states of consciousness where they would have this angelic manifestation or see a light descending through the clouds or whatever the case may be. Those stupefacents, those exciters, they would fit the bill of Bachelor's Delight just as easily with the same amount of speculation as the biographer made. Prior to his death in 1842, Freddie Willie could have provided Joe with the necessary plant medicines to function as basically date rape drugs or visionary psychedelics, which would provide the sought-for spiritual confirmations of angels commanding plural marriage, just like Lucy Walker and others like her experienced. So now let's talk about the role of plant medicines used as abortifacients. Joe had over 30 wives, right, with whom he probably had many sexual encounters, but no verifiable descendants came from any of these women. Allegations arose from multiple sources that John C. Reckitt Bennett was performing abortions in order to keep the practice of polygamy concealed. When conflict eventually arose between Joe and Reckitt Bennett, Bennett published his expose, Joseph Smith on the Mormons, History of the Saints, making accusations concerning that polygamy was what was called spiritual wifery, right? And of course, once again, check the Patreon-exclusive feed for History of the Saints, as well as episodes 120 through 134 for the entire Bennett meltdown. So, after much deliberation, affidavits were finally taken in Nauvoo, claiming Smith to be a pious and pure religious leader, while Bennett was hypocritically derided for his unchristian-like conduct with women. Now, the line between spiritual wifery and celestial marriage was born out of necessity of differentiating between, Joe's God-sanctioned polygamy and Bennett's sexual exploits that they called spiritual wifery, although the systems were functionally the same. Joe's brother, the patriarch over the church, Hiram Sidekick Biff Smith, provides an interesting logistical detail into how polygamy was kept secret with the help of Bennett. Quote, several females who testified that John C. Bennett endeavored to seduce them and accomplished his designs by saying it was right, that it was one of the mysteries of God, that it was perfectly right to have illicit intercourse with females, providing no one knew it but themselves, and also stating that he would be responsible for their sins, if there were any, and that he would give them medicine to produce abortions, provided they should become pregnant, end quote. Bennett's familiarity with herbal medicine wasn't limited to just healing or obstetrics. Quote, one of these witnesses, a married woman that he attended upon in his professional capacity while she was sick, as her obstetrician, stated that he made proposals to her of a similar adulterous nature. He told her that he wished her husband was dead, and that if he was dead, he would marry her and clear out with her. He also begged her permission to give him, her husband, medicine to that effect. He did try to give him medicine, but he would not take it, implying poisoning, right? Bennett and other herbal physicians who were close to Joseph Smith had the knowledge base necessary to provide chemical and surgical abortions, to provide these love filters, and to poison men that they wanted put out of the way, and also to treat expected venereal diseases that were attendant with the amount of sex going on in Nauvoo. If Reckitt Bennett didn't have the expertise in these fields, he'd be a terrible brothel owner, right? Another contemporary expose from Joseph H. Jackson details how Joseph Smith, quote, had only to tell certain of his spiritual wives that such a man had been in the Missouri War and that he should be put out of the way and his property and money consecrated to the use of the church. Then said he, it is damned easy for them to get on his good graces and mix a white powder with his victuals and put him out of the way, end quote. Episode 161. Now, the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. So, I mean, yeah, arsenic, right? Probably arsenic, or who knows, some white powder. Arsenic fits the bill really well. It was abundantly available, easy to acquire, and sold for medicinal purposes. Or it could be extracted from various poisons, including from nightshades. Various deadly poisons could be extracted and turned into powder, crystallized into a powder that could be mixed into a drink that wouldn't give off any fumes or anything that would cause people to be suspicious of it. So Bennett and Joseph H. Jackson here, both of them were, claimed that there was poisonings going on to put inconvenient men out of the way. So not just abortions, but not just venereal diseases, not just love filters and stupefactions, but also, murder recipes. There's a lot to it, right? Notably, the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, he published Primitive Physic, or an Easy and Natural Method of Curing Most Diseases, in 1761. And it's complete with numerous powerful herbal recipes. And that was 7 decades before Thomsonian vegetable medicine entered the medical lexicon and people became Thomsonian physicians like White Atwilla Richards and Freddie G. Willie and others who were close to Joe. Now, obviously considered of great importance due to the recipe being the first listed after the introduction was, quote, a daily decoction of lignum goeacum. I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce a lot of these plants. And that was supposed to be administered in order to induce abortions. And additionally, the popular and widely accessible Culpeper's Herbal Physician cites a number of contemporarily popular abortifacients such as pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, stating that in the case of tansy, that, quote, when served in wine, tansy would procure women's courses, end quote. Ebenezer Sibley, the same author of Occult Sciences, which was used as source material for the Smith family money-digging magic toolkit, right, also worked as a botanical illustrator, and Ebenezer Sibley provided picture plates for the contemporary editions of Culpeper's Herbal Physician. Sibley even kindly provided sections of the herbal as an appendix to his book on the occult. Like, clearly equipped with ample means and know-how, like, family planning has an interesting and well-established roots in Victorian and antebellum Mormon history, and in human history long before those periods. Episode 141. So in whatever capacity love filters and abortifacients may or may not have been employed in Nauvoo Mormonism, the knowledge and the expertise existed. Now, whether Joe himself was familiar with and utilizing this controversial part of coercive and discreet herbal medicine, or one of the other herbal physicians in leadership roles better fits that possibility, right? The evidence available today exhibits that usage of these plants was not only commonplace, but possibly a necessary component of Nauvoo polygamy. So if I'm not stating myself clear enough, I posit that Joe used date rape drugs and psychedelics to coerce women into sexual relations with him, who he'd then force to have chemical and surgical abortions in order to keep polygamy secret. Now, like I said, we had to take a step into that darker side of plant medicines because that's where it fits into this series, and it's a subject that deserves study, exploration, and expansion because it's uncomfortable and it's very disturbing. And it's one of those taboo topics that historians don't touch. If we don't confront history that challenges our ideas and our convictions, we fall into telling the same stories the same way and nobody learns anything new. Now, to a larger point, to round out this 3rd episode in our Road to Carthage series. Because he made his life about religion and expounding on theology, the nature of God, and expanding Christianity to include many proprietary elements, Joseph Smith is often a person who's regarded as larger than life, right? He was a flawed man, but he's still a prophet of God. His sins were because he was a man, but the gospel he restored itself as perfect. Because of the position in which he placed himself, the stories we find of his conduct viewed as sins through our presentist lens require explanation or justification within the Mormon worldview. To what extent his sins influenced his revelations, it seems to be a pretty prickly subject, right? Did Joe's libido factor into his revelation about polygamy? Did Joe's penchant for land and business speculation factor into his revelations about the United Order and the Mormons forgiving all debts? Did his white supremacy factor into racist elements in the books of Mormon, Moses, and Abraham? These are foundational questions which challenge the very concept of God and God's influence on Joseph Smith's claimed scriptures. If we can't disentangle the man from the revelations he claimed came from God, why do we have any reason to believe the revelations actually did come from God, or even that God exists in the first place, right? Thus, we are left with pathetic and thought-stopping platitude like, the man was flawed, but the gospel is perfect. This is inherently flawed logic for a couple of reasons. First, it views Joe's conduct through a presentist lens, and it places value judgments based on our current systems of morality and religious tenets. Modern Mormonism forbids all alcohol consumption, but Joe's entire legacy is marked from binge to binge, and he was drunk during the gunfight that killed him. Right? People viewed alcohol and drugs differently in the 19th century than we do today, and to impose our system of beliefs or morality on them is a broken way to study history. Second, the element of divine influence can never be determined, right? Any historical theory which claims the intervention or influence of God is theology, not history, leaving us with a flawed man and a gospel which isn't perfect so much as proprietary. Third, the proposition of forming a religion is, at best, an amoral proposition. When a believer looks at Joseph Smith's legacy, they must weigh his perceived sins in the balance of the moral good of restoring the perfect gospel to earth, right? And that's the most righteous and moral act any person could do, with consequences extending from eternity to eternity, hinging on that pivotal first vision experience in 1820. For a non-believer or a skeptic like yours truly, forming a religion is almost always an immoral and self-serving act, meaning we don't weigh Joe's perceived sins on a balance scale with restoring the one true gospel as much as we see it within the larger context of religious leaders in general forming their religions for self-aggrandizement and narcissism. So the crucial flaw in this logic is belief. Belief in the untestable, unprovable, and unverifiable. When we strip away the belief component, what we're left with is materialism, naturalism, skepticism without any access to the divine. We're left with naked Mormon history. A postmodern view of a dude who told everybody that he speaks for God, who would stop at nothing to build the strongest and most vast and sweeping religious empire the world has ever seen. So with a skeptical approach to the proposition of God or the divine, we need naturalistic models to understand and inform Mormon history, as well as the life and times of a man who's seen as nearest perfection as humans can get for millions of people across the globe. Simply put, artifacts within Mormon history that have most often been attributed to God require explanation within the natural world, within the naked human world. When Joe said that he saw angels and deity, and dozens of his contemporaries claim the same, we need historical models to explain it. When we know Joe had like 36 wives, we need historical models which account for sex to explain why he doesn't have any living descendants from those non-consensual encounters. When we see that Joe kept a cabal of esoteric-minded herbal physicians within arm's reach at all times, we need to consider if there might be a historical reason for that beyond the simple idea that like they were devoted and loyal converts. When we see a pattern of debauchery and concomitant visionary experiences with Joe and his early visionary church, we must search for historical models which incorporate these many variables into a larger umbrella theory. For those and many other reasons, I believe a powerful missing key to the kingdom of Mormon history is psychedelics and plant medicines broadly. How did Joe experience theophany in the sacred grove? Plants. How did so many Mormons see God and angels? Plants. How did Joe come up with such expansive and fascinating theology? Plants. How could Joe produce seemingly on-demand visions and revelations for his closest followers who believed until the day they died? Plants. How did Joe convince dozens of women to have sex with him? Plants. And a lot of charisma. And that's kind of the case with all of these because every good shaman is charismatic, right? How did Joe keep his sex empire from actually multiplying and replenishing the earth? Plants. How did Joe put his enemies out of the way without raising suspicion? Plants again. How did Joe produce seemingly miraculous healings with nothing more than a prayer and some consecrated oil? Plants in that oil. And to draw an even finer point on everything we've discussed today, why has this theory never been explored in depth at the academic level before? Because Mormons don't do drugs. And anybody who has done psychedelics who's listening to this podcast right now is like, yeah, makes sense. Oh yeah, no, I could totally see that as the case, right? As of right now, there is one single book from the 1970s written by a general authority at the time about Joe's drinking habits, which had never been explored. And before that book, and in that book, Lamar Peterson never even explored the possibility of psychedelics as part of that debauchery. Hearts Made Glad. It's a wonderful little book. It's less than 300 pages, and it has various poetry that's peppered throughout the pages about debauchery, making the endnotes a complete nightmare, but it's important foundational work for the drinking habits of Joseph Smith. It wasn't until 2007 that somebody with medical training actually wrote an academic paper on psychedelics and early Mormonism titled Restoration in the Sacred Mushroom by Robert Beckstead. Then, in 2017, Cody Nakoni and I built on Beckstead's work and presented Revelation Through Hallucination, a treatise on the Smith entheogen theory at Sunstone, resurrecting a theory that lay dormant for a decade. Then, Cody Nakoni, Robert Beckstead, Michael Winkleman, and myself compiled our collective research and published it in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies on June 1st, 2019, episodes 186 through 188. With setting apart enough time, the mindset of perseverance, and probably a large dose of luck, I'll be compiling all of this information into a book that will help unlock a complicated aspect of the Mormon history kingdom. And I want to share so many more stories, but I've already drained enough glasses just writing just these 33 pages of scripts, so let's call it a night. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.